Silence is one of the most powerful languages we'll ever speak, especially in relationships where you've given and given and given, only to find yourself with someone who avoids, withdraws, or minimizes your value. For the super empath, love has always been an act of deep generosity. You notice things others miss, you give what others can't, and you pour yourself out with a hope that one day the other person will finally meet you where you are. But here's the truth: an avoidant rarely meets you there. Not because you're unworthy, but because intimacy exposes what they fear the most: connection. So what happens when the empath, the one who always reaches across the gap, finally chooses silence? That silence isn't punishment. It's not revenge. It's clarity. It's the moment when the empath realizes, my love is precious, my peace is priceless, and my silence is the proof of both. And here's the irony. The avoidant can ignore words, they can dismiss pleas, they can even dodge accountability. But they can't escape silence. Because silence removes the game. It removes the chase. It leaves them facing themselves, often for the first time. That is the final karma. The empath doesn't need to get even. They don't need to explain. They don't need to shout. Their absence becomes the loudest truth the avoidant will ever encounter. And long after, when the world grows quiet, that silence will echo, reminding them of the one connection they could not avoid forever. Silence is one of the most misunderstood yet powerful forms of communication. Most people rush to fill gaps in conversation with words, explanations, or reassurances, believing that silence is empty. But silence is never empty. It carries weight. It carries energy. It says something without saying anything at all. When someone who has always spoken up, always explained, always reached out suddenly chooses silence, that shift becomes louder than any argument, louder than any plea, louder than any declaration of love or pain. It is a language that cannot be ignored, even by the one who tries hardest to avoid. Silence is not passive. It is not weakness. In fact, it is one of the strongest signals a person can send because it represents a decision. Anyone can argue. Anyone can beg to be understood. Anyone can repeat themselves until they are blue in the face. But it takes strength to choose stillness. It takes courage to let go of words and trust that your energy alone communicates what needs to be said. Silence is a form of self-possession. It tells the other person, I no longer need to explain my worth. I no longer need to fight to be seen. I am here, and that is enough. When an empath, someone who naturally gives and expresses, chooses silence, the contrast is even more striking. The avoidant may have grown used to tuning out words, brushing off emotional conversations, or dismissing heartfelt explanations. But silence denies them that familiar escape. There are no words to twist, no dialogue to dodge, no debate to shut down. Silence forces space. It forces the avoidant to sit with themselves, with the absence of the very presence they once took for granted. What makes silence powerful is not just what it withholds, but what it offers clarity. It shifts the dynamic. Instead of trying to be heard, the empath decides to hear themselves. Instead of pouring energy outward, they direct it inward. Silence becomes a declaration of self-respect. It says, I will not exhaust myself convincing someone to value me. I will not explain my needs again and again while they pretend not to hear. I will simply stop speaking, and in that space, I will reclaim my peace. And here is where the power lies. Silence lingers. Words can be forgotten, dismissed, or misinterpreted, but silence haunts. Long after the empath has withdrawn, the quiet remains like an unfinished sentence in the mind of the avoidant. They may not admit it, but the silence gnaws at them. It reminds them of what they lost, what they pushed away, and what can no longer be retrieved. The absence of noise becomes the loudest truth they cannot escape. Silence, in this way, becomes the ultimate boundary, the most eloquent closure, and the strongest voice of all. To love as an empath is to love with depth that often goes unseen by the casual observer. It is not just about grand gestures or spoken affection, but about the constant flow of energy that quietly holds a relationship together. The empath notices the shift in tone, the unspoken sigh, the glance that carries hidden weight. They anticipate needs before they are voiced, they give comfort before pain is confessed, and they offer understanding even when none is asked for. Loving in this way is not a calculated effort. It is instinctual. It is who they are. Their generosity is not performative, but an expression of their essence. Empaths give because they feel deeply. To them, connection is not surface level, it is soul level. They remember the details others overlook: the coffee order, the childhood story, the way someone looks when they're pretending to be fine. They pour their time, their presence, and their patience into another person, often without expectation of recognition. And yet, beneath this endless giving, there is often an unspoken hope that one day someone will reflect back the same depth of care, the same devotion, the same willingness to see and hold them fully. This hope is what makes their generosity so vulnerable. The empath continues to show up, even when met with distance. They continue to give, even when their offerings are dismissed. They continue to love, even when love is not returned with the same intensity. For them, withdrawing feels unnatural, almost like betraying their own nature. They would rather exhaust themselves than risk making another feel abandoned. And so, their love becomes a constant current, steady and reliable, even in the face of indifference. But this generosity, as beautiful as it is, often becomes misunderstood. To someone who avoids closeness, the depth of an empath's love can feel overwhelming, suffocating even. It shines a light on vulnerabilities they would rather keep hidden. Instead of receiving the gift of this devotion, the avoidant may distance themselves further, pushing away what feels too intense. And yet, paradoxically, they rely on it. They lean on the certainty that the empath will keep giving, will keep forgiving, will keep being there no matter what. What makes the empath's love so remarkable is that it does not come from a place of weakness, though it is often mistaken as such. It comes from strength. It takes courage to keep opening your heart in a world that often rewards indifference. It takes resilience to remain compassionate in the face of rejection. And it takes profound character to choose to love deeply when others settle for half measures. The tragedy and the triumph of the empath's love is this: they give with a purity that cannot be forgotten. Even when unappreciated in the moment, the memory of that love lingers. The avoidant may not acknowledge it now, but the day comes when they realize that no one else gave to them in that way, with that level of selfless intensity. That is the mark an empath leaves behind, not through words, not through demands, but through the unmatched generosity of their heart. Avoidants are often misunderstood, both by those who love them and by themselves. On the surface, they may appear calm, independent, and self-sufficient. They give off the impression that they do not need much from anyone, that they can handle life on their own terms. But beneath that exterior lies a fragile truth. Intimacy terrifies them. It is not because they are incapable of love, but because closeness threatens the defenses they have carefully built to protect themselves from vulnerability. When someone leans in, when connection grows too strong, the avoidant instinctively pulls back, not because the other person is unworthy, but because the avoidant fears being seen too clearly. For an empath who loves deeply, this behavior can feel confusing and even painful. They pour affection, consistency, and attention into the relationship, only to be met with distance. The avoidant might dismiss the importance of conversations, deflect questions about feelings, or minimize the needs of their partner. This dynamic creates a frustrating cycle. The more the empath reaches, the more the avoidant withdraws. The empath wonders if they are not enough, if their love is somehow excessive or misplaced. But the truth is, the avoidance retreat is never about the empath's worth. It is about the avoidant's fear. That fear often comes from a history of unmet needs. Somewhere along the way, they learned that depending on others was dangerous or disappointing. They taught themselves to rely only on their own strength, to minimize desires, to downplay emotions, to guard their hearts. Intimacy, for them, is not just closeness. It is exposure, and exposure feels unsafe. So when an empath offers pure and unconditional love, instead of receiving it as a gift, the avoidant perceives it as a threat to their carefully maintained sense of control. This is why avoidants often sabotage the very relationships they secretly crave. They long for connection, but the moment it becomes real, they feel the urge to run. They want to be loved, but they struggle to stay present when love is given too freely. It is not that they do not see the value of the empath's devotion. They do. But seeing it and accepting it are two very different things. And in their attempt to preserve their own emotional safety, they end up pushing away the one person who offered them exactly what they needed. What makes this so tragic is that avoidants are not immune to the impact of the love they resist. They feel it even when they act indifferent. They remember it even when they pretend to forget. The empath's kindness and devotion leave an imprint that lingers long after the silence has fallen. But in the moment, fear outweighs desire, defense outweighs vulnerability. And so the cycle repeats. The empath gives, the avoidant retreats, and both are left unsatisfied, not because the connection was lacking, but because the avoidant could not allow themselves to fully embrace it. Silence, when chosen by the empath, is often mistaken for indifference, but it is anything but that. It is not about punishing the other person or seeking revenge for the distance and avoidance they've endured. Instead, it is the moment the empath decides to stop explaining themselves, stop negotiating for their worth, and stop bleeding energy into a space that refuses to hold it. Silence is the empath's way of stepping back into alignment with themselves. It is clarity, not cruelty. It is peace, not punishment. It is the decision to preserve one's dignity when words have lost their power. For the empath, choosing silence does not come easily. They are natural communicators of love, endlessly willing to try again, to rephrase, to soften their message in hopes of being heard. But when those efforts are consistently met with resistance, dismissal, or withdrawal, silence emerges as the only language left. It is not chosen impulsively, but deliberately. It is a boundary made visible through absence. It says, "I have said enough. I have given enough. I am enough." It shifts the dynamic entirely because silence carries a strength that words no longer can. Unlike anger, which can be dismissed as emotional, or pleading, which can be disregarded as needy, silence is unarguable. There is nothing to debate, nothing to deny, nothing to dismiss. It is a mirror the avoidant cannot escape. In that quiet, the empath no longer fights to be understood. They no longer chase after someone who runs. They no longer offer explanations to ears that refuse to listen. Instead, they reclaim their energy, redirecting it toward their own healing and self-respect. What makes this silence powerful is that it is rooted in self-love. It is not meant to teach the avoidant a lesson, though often it does. It is not meant to make the other person feel abandoned, though they might. The silence is about choosing to no longer abandon oneself. The empath learns that their voice does not need to echo in an empty room, and their love does not need to be wasted on someone who avoids intimacy. In that stillness, they rediscover their own value, untainted by rejection or dismissal. For the avoidant, this silence can feel jarring. They were accustomed to the words, the reassurances, the endless attempts at connection. The silence removes that safety net. It removes the dynamic they relied on, the expectation that the empath would always return. Suddenly, they are left with the weight of their own choices, confronted by the very emptiness they created. And though the empath never intended it as punishment, the silence becomes the one thing the avoidant cannot ignore. In this way, silence becomes the purest form of truth. It does not demand recognition. It does not seek validation. It does not bargain for change. It simply exists strong and unshakable. For the empath, it is the sound of freedom. For the avoidant, it is the echo of what they could not hold on to. And for both, it is clarity, an unspoken acknowledgement that words have run their course, and the silence now speaks louder than anything ever could. The silence of an empath does not fade like words do. It does not blur with time or get tangled in arguments that can be rewritten in memory. It lingers sharp and unyielding, like a presence that remains even in absence. For the avoidant, who once relied on the empath's steady flow of love and forgiveness, that silence becomes unforgettable. It is the final karma, not in the sense of punishment, but in the sense of consequence. When someone has been endlessly available, endlessly giving, endlessly patient, their absence becomes louder than their presence ever was. It is in that absence that the avoidant begins to feel the weight of what they pushed away. The avoidant can run from words. They can dismiss pleas, downplay needs, or retreat into indifference when confronted. But silence is different. Silence offers no foothold, no argument to counter, no dialogue to evade. It leaves them alone with themselves, with the stark reality that the connection they once took for granted is no longer within reach. And unlike words which can be replayed in the mind with twists and justifications, silence cannot be rewritten. It is final. It is definitive. It speaks of an ending without saying a word. This is what makes the empath's silence unforgettable. It strips away the illusions. The avoidant may have believed the empath would always be there, no matter how far they pulled away. They may have counted on forgiveness, on another chance, on another conversation that bought them more time. But silence removes those options. It closes the door without slamming it. It leaves nothing but stillness, and in that stillness, the truth becomes undeniable. The empath has chosen themselves. The final karma lies not in the empath seeking revenge, but in their refusal to participate in the cycle any longer. The avoidant is left with the very thing they feared most: intimacy with themselves. For perhaps the first time, they are forced to sit with the emptiness that avoidance creates. And in that quiet, they begin to remember. They remember the small kindnesses, the patience, the unconditional love. They remember how it felt to be seen so fully and still accepted. They remember the warmth that once waited for them at the other end of their distance. The silence becomes a contrast that highlights all of it, making the absence feel heavier than the presence ever did. For the empath, silence is liberation. For the avoidant, it is revelation, and long after the empath has walked away, long after they have healed and found peace elsewhere, that silence continues to echo in the avoidant's memory. It cannot be forgotten because it is not just silence. It is the sound of consequence. It is the quiet reminder of the one person who gave what no one else did and whose absence speaks a truth that no noise can cover. That truth becomes their final karma, the silence that endures, the silence that defines the loss, the silence that the avoidant never escapes. The journey of the super empath and the avoidant is not a story of winners and losers, nor is it about proving who was right or wrong. It is about understanding the power of love, the cost of silence, and the beauty of reclaiming oneself. The final karma is not about punishment. It is about truth. It is about the empath realizing that their heart, their energy, their peace are not meant to be wasted on someone who cannot receive them. It is about the avoidant finally facing the silence that echoes louder than words ever could. The silence is not cruel. It is compassionate. Compassionate first to the self and second to the one who must learn through absence what they could not appreciate in presence. That silence will echo, not just as a reminder of loss, but as a lesson that love, when taken for granted, does not wait forever. And for the empath, that silence becomes freedom, the space to grow, to heal, and to give again, but this time to someone who is ready to hold it with both hands. So if you find yourself in this dynamic, remember silence is not weakness. Silence is not retreat. Silence is your strength, your clarity, and your final word. The avoidant may never forget it, but more importantly, you will never regret it, because silence is where your dignity speaks loudest. Thank you for giving me the gift of your time and attention today. May you walk away from this not only with understanding, but with the courage to honor your worth, the strength to protect your peace, and the wisdom to let your silence speak when words no longer serve. Goodbye and thank you.